software guy.
I'm going to swing through the panel one more time, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So please be thinking of questions, and we'll get to the audience in just about the next 10 minutes or so. So Jorge, in the last 12, 15 months, I guess you've worked with a dozen or more clients, maybe 20, I think was your target in the first year. The identities of a couple of them are known. One was interviewed in the New York Times early last year. Another was an enterprising reporter who, I wish I'd had this idea, had a magazine, GQ, I think it was, actually pay for a part of their sequencing work, and that was an interesting article published end of last year. Without breaching patient sequencer confidentiality, what can you tell us about some of the specifics in terms of genetic disease risk or some of their reactions to this information? Have they got it? Have they been disappointed for the value for money that they've received?
Sure. So a couple of things. First of all, on that GQ article, if you haven't seen it, Rick Powers went through the process with us and wrote a very long piece on this. Talked about his experience, his expectations, what he learned, which for us was actually a fascinating experience. When the GQ people were finalizing the details, after I'd met with them, I asked them if they were going to send a photographer, because we of course wanted to be in GQ, and he looked at me and said, "It's not going to be necessary." Which was unfortunate. Instead, they put in a picture of a DNA made out of alphabet soup, a DNA helix made out of A's, C's, T's, and G's from alphabets, which was really upsetting to me personally, but it's okay. But no, to answer your question, the experience, like I said earlier, has been fascinating. So there's a couple anecdotes that we can talk about without actually going through and divulging anything about the individuals that we work with. So as I said at the outset, we had a very simple idea at the beginning, which was, if we put out a business that is going to sequence whole genomes for people, can we do it in a way, well, first of all, is there a market for this? Because it's still very, very expensive. And can we do it in a way that would be meaningful for individuals? Because if you can't do it at a price where an individual, even a very early adopter with a lot of money, is going to find any value, you don't have a business. So as a proof for ourselves, we did something very simple. We said, instead of going out and raising a lot of venture capital money and trying to build out an infrastructure, if the timing is wrong and we're too early, let's actually let's hang out our shingle and see if we can attract customers and let them, working with us, essentially fuel the business. And that's what we did. And so if we had been wrong in that initial hypothesis, I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now, because they've, fortunately, through their pioneering work and their willingness to work with us and frankly fund us through providing us revenue, we wouldn't be sitting here right now. So that was the first thing. So we went through this process with the first individual who started the sequencing process in January of 2008. This had been done but a few times before this, certainly never been done by us or by any company similar to us providing this for a private individual that was doing this as a consumer. And one of the guys on my team, a guy named Ari Karicki, has a great analogy that he throws out, where he says, more people, when we started the company, more people had walked on the surface of the moon than had actually been able to have their full genome sequenced. Fortunately, we can say that's no longer the case. There's been 12 astronauts, and unfortunately, we've been able to surpass that. But we didn't know just like when we got to the moon, we didn't know what to expect. We weren't sure what to expect with these individuals. So when we started with this first client in January of 2008, the first thing we wanted to do was make sure that we were setting the right expectations. So we flew someone over to Geneva to meet with him and sit down and talk to him about what kind of information he would be getting, what we could say, and more importantly, what we couldn't say with this data. And as Dietrich mentioned, one of the challenges and that one of the places you want to get to is where you can talk about common variants, you can talk about rare variants, you can talk about structural variants. And we had built some pretty neat tools to do that, knowing that they would get better over time. So that's the first expectation you want to set. The second expectation you want to set is that there may be actionability and there may not be actionability for certain things. And so we wanted to make sure he was comfortable with receiving things that would be actionable and things that wouldn't be. And so we went through that whole process, and we've refined it, and we've gotten better at it. When we flew him over to Boston to review his results, and the way we do things is a bit unique because we have the benefit of working with a small number of clients as opposed to trying to go after a mass market at this stage. We sit them in a room with our geneticists, our bioinformaticians, a genetic counselor, and some other folks, clinicians and others. to go through the data, and that provides us the opportunity to do a couple things. One is to make sure that the information that they're receiving, that they're interpreting it correctly. And there's no better way to do that than to do that live. Because if you send somebody a web page with their data, you don't know what they're going to read into that. And we've seen this time and time again, where individuals ask a question that clearly demonstrates they didn't understand what you just told them. And so this is just a way to backtrack and re-engage. And we went through that process with them, and this is a full-day session we do with them. They meet with a bunch of folks. Then they go, and if they choose to do so, they go and meet with experts, specialists that we can set up appointments with, neurologists or cardiologists or anyone else throughout we have the good fortune, obviously, of being here in Boston, so we have a lot of doors we can knock on. So once we did all of that, our first question was this person satisfied? And in my mind, like I said earlier, the best example of the fact that he was satisfied is that he became our first source of referrals. And since then, since we worked with this first individual, we have worked with upwards of 5 or 6 of his closest friends. And so in that regard, I think he's been very happy. The other thing that we didn't really anticipate is that when you charge someone that much money, they expect some pretty high service. So we see this individual once or twice a month when he comes in. So, but it's been a good experience thus far.
John, I want to briefly touch on electronic health records, which is a major interest of yours. And in a few years' time, Navigenics and Complete Genomics are going to be sequencing individuals. And I'm thinking of this, each individual is going to have millions of discrete, many unique variants, thousands of unique SNPs and variants are being found every year and going into databases such as OMIM. And yet your average physician, as one of your colleagues, Sandy Aronson, pointed out just here yesterday in one of the tracks, the average physician has 14.7 minutes to try to impart this information to the confused consumer. There's a problem here, I think.
Well, absolutely. So folks have followed the Boston Globe over the last 2 weeks. You've seen this interesting experience I've had in sharing data with patients. So Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center partnered with Google, we partnered with Microsoft, and we said we're going to share the clinical record and the administrative record with patients. Well, as probably folks know, there's a difference between clinical data your doctor writes and the insurance company billing, which is an interpretation, not necessarily a granular one. Well, we had ePatient Dave, one of our patients, say, well, I looked at my 58 episodes of care and my 92 ICD-9 codes, and boy, I had kind of widening of my aorta, and the ICD-9 code was aortic aneurysm. That sounds awful. Well, is there an ICD-9 code for widening of the aorta? No. Aortic aneurysm is the closest. So the Globe said, gee, American medicine today has this gap between clinical observation, patient education, and understanding. Well, with the genome, this is going to be horrific. How do you explain to somebody something that's probabilistic, not deterministic, and what they should do about it? So there's got to be a whole industry taking your database and other things you guys work on, raw data, getting into something the patient can understand, actionable and non-actionable, and then figuring out how does the doc who has 14.7 minutes make this useful to the patient, and that's got to be leveraging other experts, no question. So I have learned over the last 2 weeks, and the Globe even wrote an editorial on this, murder, death, war, and, patient ICD-9 coding not granular enough. I mean, how strange was that? That you really have to think of not just the science, but the whole patient education. That has to be a focus of our next few years.
Right. Jorge, by the way, if GQ doesn't want your photograph, we'll put it in BioIT. Well, that's almost as prestigious.